I just want to say, Professor Smith, I organized many library conferences in my day, and I always will remember when it comes to drinking that I sat with the hotel manager at one hotel where we frequently held the conferences, and after the first time we held their conference there, the second time he turned to his bar manager and he said, "Double the inventory." So I think we do have a bit of a reputation there. Well, I'm here today to talk to you about library service platforms and what they mean for libraries. So let me get started here. First, I want to tell you a little bit about the University of Oklahoma, where I come from. I think it's an interesting institution and one that many people don't know about. But this is a picture of the old building and the new building at the university. And it's a magnificent facility. We have inside of it classic reading rooms that are, almost European in their look and feel. And as I speak right now, we're in the process of building a new learning commons to accommodate the collaborative learning style of today's students. Whereas in the past, the stacks were closed. You had to hand a librarian your slip. They'd go get your books and bring them, and you'd sit at one of those tables and study. Now, of course, what the students want is to learn in a very collaborative atmosphere. There's a lot of lessons for us in that very step happening within our libraries. So we'll go through this in a little more detail here, but I think it's very, very interesting to note that that's what we're dealing with in libraries today. A lot of people, since I've been here, and I've talked to a number of folks, have said, "Where is Oklahoma?" It doesn't seem like it's common knowledge. So I threw this map in here just to explain where we're located in the U.S. So we're right out there in the middle of the country, right over Texas. Very well-known state for tornadoes is one thing we're very well known for. But that's where we're at, and that's where we're located. The agenda, the things I want to cover today. I want to speak to you just a little bit to give you some basis of where are library service platforms emerging from? What is the data? What are the challenges that this kind of technology is trying to address? Now, of course, the U.S. represents about half of the global library marketplace. So this is U.S.-based data, and you'll need to factor that in looking at it. But it is, in fact, what's helping drive an awful lot of what's happening in that field. We're going to talk about how we're going to try and address those challenges through the technology that we have. And then I want to give you some thoughts on evaluating these new library service platforms, because there's a number of them out there. They're emerging in various states of approach, and all of those things need evaluation by you to make sure you pay properly for your library, because we're all at different points and different conditions in our libraries. So then I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the concerns I have about some of the library service platforms, things that I think we need to, as a profession, take into consideration, be thinking about as we move forward with this technology. And then I'll have some time for Q&A at the end, hopefully. So let's start with the current challenges and trends that we're dealing with. And I'd like to point out right away that this one, I think, is really something we all have to be thinking about. When we're looking at what we're now spending out of our budgets on electronic content, we're now over 60% is being spent on electronic content. Now that's great for our students because they want electronic content. They don't want to have to get up and go get an item physically off the shelf. They want to have it delivered to their device, whether it's a PC, a phone, or a tablet, and they want to be able to use it right there. I've noted, as I go to meetings around our library, I frequently walk the stacks just to see what's going on. And I will note that in Oklahoma, in the 8 months I've been there, I have seen 2 students actually pulling anything off of the bookshelves in all the time I've been there. We put a lot of money in those physical collections, and they sit there largely unused. I ran some stats recently and looked at the books we had bought in the last year. If I factor out textbooks, out of the 35,000 new works that we added to our collection last year, less than 5,000 circulated one time. The rest hadn't moved at all. We bought them, we processed them, we sat them on that shelf, and they didn't go anywhere. We have to be thinking about that. We can't ignore the reality of what that represents. Digital content is what our users increasingly want, and we have to be thinking about investing appropriately. At the same point in time, I think this chart is fascinating. It's from the Association of Research Libraries in North America, but it points out that since the 1980s, where we had around 4% of the university budget, over time we're now down to almost 2%. That's a little bit scary, but I think it also reflects the value the institution is adding to the university. If they don't see it, they don't invest in it. And there's a lesson in there as marketers and the way we develop and offer services to our users, and we cannot ignore the reality of what that chart represents. If we were as valued as we'd like to think we are, that chart wouldn't be going in that direction. So that's a real concern for us. Here's another one that I find just fascinating. Number of librarians. Look at that chart. It goes up until about 1980, and then we see it start dropping off. We're not making as many librarians as we did in the past. Now, you might think, oh, okay, market demands, that's good news for me, right? That means yeah, maybe. But here's the next thing to consider when you're looking at this chart. Look at the age of librarians. Again, we got a whole bunch of people that are getting ready to exit. They're going to retire. So that chart is going to get even worse. Now, how do we continue to make libraries important and librarians important when we're dealing with a dwindling supply? We have to be able to make the technology extend our services in ways that we haven't done in the past. So we've got to be, when we're looking at technology, thinking about how do we use that to amplify a diminishing resource with a flat or declining budget in order to meet all the conditions that are coming at us. Then we've got the growth of data, and here I just took WorldCat as an example because it's so good. And it's rather representative of what you'll see across the field. And I'm sure many of you realize this from your day-to-day work. But if you look at the growth of data that we're dealing with, it's enormous. And it's growing rapidly, logarithmically. Massive amounts of data. And not only do we have massive amounts of data, it's becoming very multilingual. So that has real implications for us all through our systems. As we see economies around the world emerging and taking off, we're going to continue to see this trend grow. But it has a lot of implications for the technology that we have, how we're going to acquire all of these works, how we're going to get them cataloged and in the system. And we can't do it through the conventional means. I think this is a really important quote. I read this book not long ago, and I thought, you know, we don't think about this fact enough. A library, in this case it was written in the U.S., so of course it's talking about in New York or Kansas, is no longer a patron, is no longer a library for patrons in those geographic areas, but to all potential patrons residing anywhere on the planet. Wow. Think about what that means for you as librarians. Now, you've got a dwindling supply of people that know how to do this job. We got budget issues to fight. And at the same point in time, as we create open access resources and load them up, which are freely available, as we digitize our special collections and put them into the systems, they will be used by people all over the planet. When they use that, likelihood that they're going to be able to pick up a phone and call you and get help in using that collection is pretty small. Again, it's where technology is going to have to step up and connect us with our end users in new ways that we haven't done in the past. I think if you want to summarize that data very quickly, what you have to realize is that everything we do, we're at a point in time where we're going to have to scale it up massively to be able to offer services on a global basis to all the users that want to get to our information. Think about that, and that has a lot of implications, and we'll talk about how we're going to address that. because technology is the answer to an awful lot of those challenges. How do we prepare to massively scale? We look at the technology, we look at the resources that we have to amplify in order to offer the services that we need to offer. Professor Smith outlined some of those a few moments ago. Those are the things we've got to be doing, but we've got to be doing it on a larger basis, and technology we're using is what we've got to do. So when we look at our existing technology, we have to realize we've built a lot of silos in our field. Now, for good reason. When we started out, we had print collections. We built automation that handled print collections. We started taking on licensed electronic data. We built systems to handle that. Ran them right next to and parallel to our print system. As we started creating repositories and building digital data, we started building systems to handle that. Now, the problem we've got with a lot of that existing technology is it has a lot of redundancy. Between the print, the electronic, and the digital, we created a lot of redundant steps. And so when you look at the earlier slides that said, hey, we got a dwindling resource in librarians here, we can't be wasting our time and energy on redundancy. We have to be more efficient. I've been with many librarians who have said, you know, the provost is saying, you've got to do more with less. And of course, lots of librarians say, good God, we can't do more with less. We're already doing as much as can possibly be done. But what I remind people is what you're really being told when you hear that statement, do more with less, is be more efficient, be more effective. Look at your operations and where can you squeeze out resources. When you're looking at the silos we've created in dealing with technology, these are places where we can squeeze out redundancy and efficiency and create more resources. This book I read also very recently, and I thought, here's a great quote. And while I'm not talking about library systems, it certainly applies to us. Increasingly, when I look at the library technology that's in place, what I see is systems built for local operation, when in fact, we need to be dealing with global operations. And we'll explain why that's so important as we move along here, but it's a very powerful quote when you think about what's being said there. So, here's what I think about the ILS of the past. It needs to go. It was built to service those siloed systems. Separate functions for all of the print, digital, and electronic. The new library platforms, the library service platforms that are emerging, and we'll go through some of those in a moment, if they use true cloud computing, and that's an important distinction, and I'll explain that too in a moment, will enable us to do this. It helps us address all of the issues you've just seen, and it extends the reach of librarianship in ways we can't even dream of. But let's stop for a moment and take a look at where we are. I think it's very interesting. Marshall Breeding does a chart on his site, and I know you can't read it, but the important point is what's highlighted in the box there. To realize that library technology has really, really narrowed down. The options we have really narrowed down by about half. As we entered 2013, we're in 2013, we now have around 24 options out there in library systems. If you narrow this yet further, and if you apply the criteria that I do for determining a true cloud computing system, and there's really several things we want to be looking for there, but we want a system that's going to truly integrate our backroom operations so that we can release resources to focus on end user activities where they're needed. If we're looking to be able to support large-scale analytics, and we'll talk about analytics in a moment, and data aggregation, and I'll tell you why that's important. And if it supports true multi-tenant operations, again, I'll explain in more detail in a moment, but if you apply that criteria to the 24 systems out there, you end up with this. There's really 3 systems out there right now that really meet those criteria. We have one open source system that's emerging, But in looking at that, it's largely built on the concepts of the ILS system. So it doesn't offer some very important advantages. And the three at the bottom here are really redone ILS systems offered as software as a service now, with enhancements, and some important enhancements, but not featuring the true cloud computing criteria. So right now, we've got a fairly narrow offering if you're actually wanting to move into the new library service platforms. Now, I could go into a lot more detail about all of these products, and as Ellen said, we'd be here for 2 or 3 days if we did that, but we'll narrow this down to the important criteria. I also want to point out that I actually wrote an article for the NISO publication on library service platforms, which will give you more detail on each of the platforms, both the ones that are true cloud computing and those that are just being called library service platforms. So if you don't have or haven't read that article, you may want to get more information. But let me point out what I think are some of the really critical criteria here. Cloud computing, as I've mentioned, is to me really, really an important distinction and one that needs to be understood. And there's so much confusion even between the vendors and how they market their product. We have what's called software as a service, right? And a lot of people think if I've got software as a service, I have cloud computing. Not really. You have software as a service, which means you have the same system running that you may well have had running in your library. It's just that it's running remotely. If you're using your IT center on campus and they're running your ILS system for you, you're already technically doing cloud computing using that definition. But that's not true cloud computing. We'll get to that. Let me give you some points of differentiation. Software as a service is fine. It does an important job. It allows you to free up technical people to focus on end user activities. So it's got that value. It does do that for you. And that's not to be diminished. But here's what marks out a true cloud computing system. The new cloud computing ones that are really going to offer us major advantages have been rewritten from the ground up. They did that so that they could truly integrate all of the backroom operations. You can't easily take existing software code and make it all merge back together. You're better off to start over. And several of the companies and those products we looked at do that. Multi-tenant is something that, again, I find lots of confusion in the marketplace about. And, you know, it sounds very technical, but it's really not. It means basically, is there one copy of the software supporting all these customers that are connected to that data center? If it's not, if you have one copy of the software running for each library or consortium, that isn't one copy of the software serving all the customers. Why is that important? Well, think about, for instance, what you've gone through in updates on your software. When you update to a new version, it's painful. It usually never runs as smoothly as the vendor tells you it's going to run. And we all know that. And frequently means that each library has to move through that step individually. A lot of wasted time in that process. In a true cloud computing system that's multi-tenant, if you've got one copy of the software serving all of the customers, vendor upgrades it one time, everybody comes up on the new version. There's a savings in that. There's a savings that we should see as customers. There's a saving the vendor should see. A lot of overhead in that upgrade process has just been wiped out if it's a true multi-tenant system. The other thing that's so important in this is the analytics. And that's something we cannot underestimate the value of. Analytics, when we collect data, and we're seeing the commercial sector do this, we're actually running a bit behind in the field of librarianship. But what you're seeing is we collect data about the usage of our systems. What's happening? What are our users doing? How can we take that data and turn this into proactive services? For this to work and work well, we need to be collecting data on a global scale. Because we no longer, we hear about the global economy all the time, where we're competing not just with the people in our own country or across the continent, but we're competing with China. We're competing with India. We're competing on a global basis. We need to be able to compare data with them. So when we're working, in order to be on the cutting edge, we have to see the data collected on what they're doing. So when we go to hit the button to say, I want to compare what I'm doing to another major institution on another continent, I can do that. Increasingly, we're moving towards what is called transactional analytics. That's really powerful stuff. Transactional analytics is when the data is being compiled as the users are working with the system, and at the same point in time, we can analyze it to predict what should happen next. Now, you're seeing, as I said, in the commercial sector, this happening all the time. They're figuring out if you have a child at this point, what's the statistical probability you're going to have another child in your family X months after the birth of the first one? So they mark that purchase when you make it, and you'll note that whatever that calculation is,